Hi everyone, I'm Airier, and today we are going to be looking at something that GW doesn't pull any attention to. This is something that is absolutely fundamental to understanding the Emperor of Mankind in the Warhammer 40K and 30K, and just the entire Warhammer universe, and technically even metaverse. If you don't know what I mean by metaverse, I did an entire previous video on the Emperor's overall overarching plan and how it interacted specifically with the warp and its connotations for traveling through time and manipulating dimensions and how that entire thing shapes out. And while that's very important, that's very much forward-facing to establish the entire rationale for why the Emperor has an idea of what's coming back in the 30K form of the timeline. This video, though, we're going to be examining something that every single player and enthusiast about 40K knows on some level, but always misses. This is going to be looking at the past, looking at the apocalypse of humanity, the multiple human apocalypses, and even a few of the alien ones that did matter to humanity. Because as much as 40K is massively xenophobic about any interactions, although at the same time the GW staff and most of the fans are massively fans of the entire Primarch certain Eldar ship. Guilty. But if you don't know what I mean, you don't know what I mean. I'm just going to leave it there. What about Ray? This is something that people don't go over. It's not just the apocalypses, though. It's how... crap. I'll have to edit this. It's how the apocalypses have shaped humanity. And more importantly, how the various apocalypses have shaped the Emperor's understanding of what is possible, what needs to be done, and shines quite a bit of light on what happened already. If this sounds a little convoluted, that's because Warhammer 40K lore is massively convoluted. And while I always recommend to read the books because honestly, they're just really good. Some of them are great, others are just good, and some of them are Inquisitor. I'm not going to elaborate any more on that one. Still canon. Oh god, still canon. That being said, to try and make this easier, I'm going to actually just cite my main sources right now. First and foremost, I'm going to base most of my ideas, opinions, and theories around not just the canon works that I've entertained and, well, have been entertained by. They're great stories, seriously read them. But specifically, the stories and videos compiled by Luton. If you haven't seen any of Luton's videos, he does honest-to-God Warhammer 40K lore scholarship. He has his sources, he has his entire background built up, and at this point he probably has a better understanding of the overall lore than the people working at Games Workshop, because Luton is a beast at Warhammer scholarship. And I do mean the word scholarship. If he says something, it's been hyper researched, pinned down, quoted, and documented, sometimes in his videos and definitely in the comment section, because he will go out of his way to do an amazing job. On top of that, I'm also pulling from a few other channels as well that have, not to the same extent as Luton, if only because Luton could publish his works on literary scholarship and make an actual thing of Warhammer scholarship at this point, in the same way that there's people who publish works on Lord of the Rings. He probably would have even more source material to pull from. Maybe. Just throwing out there, Tolkien did a lot of writing about the Lord of the Rings universe. Yeah. The other ones I'm pulling from are, of course, Baldermort and... oh, God, I just forgot his name. I'll remember later, and I'm going to feel like an ass for it. Yeah, wow. But definitely Baldermort. If you haven't checked him out, I'm jealous of his voice, but he's also an incredibly detailed lore chapter. Now, he goes more into the speculative, but he shows an overall arching idea of what he understands, and then brings up his sources. Now, he's not to the same level of Luton. Luton is just the facts, only the facts, especially the facts that no one remembers, thought were made up, and then are accurate. Am I harping about Luton? Yes, I am, because he is quite the resource. Moving on, I just need to point out, this is spoiler heavy. Sort of. Because we're going to be dealing with the Emperor's past and the apocalypse is involved in it, this is a weird place to be. Yes, it is very much involving the timeline, and I will be jumping up to the 40th and 30th timelines, but I'm also going to be going so far into the past that there's only vague references that are nuanced and hard to correlate. And while it's always in the base books and it's in every source material, and it's not hidden or a brand new revelation, except for a few, they're also very much things that if you think about too hard, you kind of have an idea where the overarching lore is going, which is the entire purpose of this video, because I think there's quite a bit they hide in plain sight. And more importantly, because of a specific stream, because of the 9th edition reveal stream on Twitch, the people behind the Horus Heresy series mentioned, and I'm not even sure they were supposed to, that they've already started making a cohesive narrative for the next series after Horus Heresy finishes, which will be in 40K, moving the story forward, which, that right there, for a long part of 40K's history, is nuts. The story moved forward. Not just a Primarch coming back, which is a thing, but because there's more coming. Him being there, Guilliman being back, is just the tip of the iceberg. They said, well, without any spoilers, the biggest spoiler of them all, they have a coherent story set, and they're writing it, and they're working on it, and it's the same people behind the Horus Heresy, so there'll be some good, some bad, and some that are the mirror cracked, which I'm going to pretend is not canon because it is infuriating and terrible. Not badly written, just infuriating. Unlike Inquisitor, which I will not mention again because it hurts to say. Yeah. Wolf Lord Row. That's it. Yep. Yeah. Banda Desert. Yeah. That was it. It was Wolf Lord Row. Yeah. I'm going to be heavily editing this whenever I finally get around to that. But right now we're doing the live version, so. My editor's going to have fun with this one. Speaking of. Okay. Yep. That's still hot. Note to self. Hot coffee is hot. Don't drink. Things that should have been obvious. What I'm going to do, though, is break this down into 3 different sections that we need to focus on. And just to make this easier and less convoluted than the last video, which went all over the place but kind of needed to when dealing with the warp. It's the warp. The more you know about it, the more you realize it's chaos. Even when it's not chaotic, it is very much chaotic. In this, though, we're going to be dealing with 3 specific times. First will be the dark age of technology, the height of human anything, human everything, and potentially a few other things as well that I'm going to get on later. Then we'll be looking at Old Night, which is the second apocalypse humanity faced, followed by, and this one might be a little controversial, the fall of the Eldar. These are the 3 defining events that have set the tone for all of 40K. Now, there's a few others I'm going to mention, but those are the main 3 that have the most direct impact, not just to set the tone for the story and the entire scenario, but to try and explain what the Emperor is doing. And that's what we're looking at. We are looking at aspects building into what the Emperor's trying to do. Before, we established that he's trying to confront chaos, but his plan has moved because he has future knowledge. Now we're looking at why he had those plans in the first place. What was his past knowledge? What had he learned that the story is hiding? We don't see every aspect because Games Workshop is making a point to obscure so much of it. But they have introduced information, and they are slowly. Drip feeding is the term I want to use, but that actually might be more than they intended. But after 30 years, we actually have an idea of what happened. Maybe only on the outline, and maybe only because we can see the knock-on effects of it, but we know what happened in these apocalypses to quite a decent extent. Everything prior to them is still pretty much shrouded in mystery. But the knock-on effects have outlined what happened in their falls, what apocalypses befell humanity, and more importantly, how they affected the Emperor of Mankind in the Warhammer 40K universe. So to start with, we need to look at the first major apocalypse that humanity was directly involved in. Now, I want to specify that there were apocalypses prior to that. Everything to do with the Eldar Necron War, the Old Ones versus the Necron tier, all of that would count as apocalypse. The death of the Old Ones, supposed death, the Necrons going into slumber, honestly, the degeneration of the Eldar would itself count as a fall in its own right, but I'm not going to get into that one. That's specifics. Those are all very important for the overall setting of Warhammer, but not directly human related, unless some of the more extreme conspiracies are accurate. But we're not going to get into that either. Today, first off, we're looking at the fall of the Dark Age of technology. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what the Dark Age of technology is, this is quite literally humanity at its strongest. It is humanity able to do anything, build anything, go anywhere, do everything. It is so advanced technologically and scientifically that they were dominant above all. And this is the part that is really glossed over. There was a human federation that involved xenospecies. It was, to some extent, open and inclusive. I say by some extent because it's mostly by comparison to later 40K, which is not open, not inclusive, and oh my god, in no way, shape, or form open to the vast majority of any sentient xenospecies. If they can think and talk, humans don't really like them. That said, they're actually really fine with the non-thinking ones. They're used all the time and actually quite common, but we're also going to ignore that too, because the Imperium does a lot of ignoring that. But that's just me. The Human Federation brought the galaxy together. And we know this is important because two things happened after the fall that really highlight the importance of it. First, the absolute hatred for anything alien, anything not human. You can tell whenever the fall happened, it's because they gained massive fear over anything alien. Now, a lot of that was attributed to what happened directly after the fall, because every living xenospecies out there, everything that wasn't human, tried to kill humanity. Which is, in its own right, kind of surprising, until you look at why that would happen. In general terms, you see this kind of retaliation whenever someone of power is stepped down on, and then every other faction that didn't have the ability to before dogpiles them. You see this in the lore quite frequently, and the different power plays between Imperial houses, Xeno houses, different factions in a battle, chaos all the time. Whenever the dominant faction slips, they are dogpiled, they are torn down, and they are attacked brutally. What we see is humanity being torn down. And we already know they were the top dog because of the Dark Age of technology. But the one thing that holds true in all 40K fashion is that whenever you're the top dog, you inspire a lot of hatred, jealousy, and probably envy to a large extent. Now, this wouldn't apply to the Tau because they aren't there, but all the other Xeno factions are usually around by then. Also, technically wouldn't apply to the Necrons because they also weren't around during this time. Except for Trazyn, but Trazyn's Trazyn. If you know who he is, you know who he is. And if you don't, just think Robot Doctor Who and you kind of have it down set, actually. What this tells us about the Human Federation is that this was very much something controlled by humanity. It was not an equal partnership, because they would have had allies in the fall. The other option, though, is that it was an equal partnership, but something happened during the fall to absolutely destroy that partnership. Personally, between the two, I mostly fall in the middle ground that it was mostly human dominated, but not entirely human domination. I stick to this because prior to the collapse, humanity was always depicted, at least in how it's referenced, as very much dedicated to technology, very much dedicated to perfection and intelligence and learning. And that kind of methodology and thought process is not so much conducive to repressing alternate viewpoints, but incorporating them to basically rip everything from them that of use and then add it to your own intelligence. This is a very technocentric ideology, and that would imply a lot. Specifically, humanity as essentially a nicer version of the Borg from Star Trek, with the general structure of the Federation from Star Trek, if more human-centric. I say that just because it's Warhammer 40K. I could never in any way, shape, or form see GW making them the complete pinnacle of golden amazement. There's always that underbelly and the seediness that they involve in their fiction or their universes, which I think is, at this point, actually quite nicely done, to some extent, and some better than others. So let's recap quickly. The Golden Age of technology, or the Dark Age as everyone later knows it, involved a lot of mechanization. It involved AI. It involved massive galaxy-shaping powers and involvement of alien species that are probably resentful but willing to endure the establishment because overwhelming power. Now, I'm actually going to drop back into one of the books, specifically the early Horus Heresy books, and I'm going to apologize, I do not remember the name. This is one of the early battles Horus had against a technological human faction that defined themselves as the truest expression of humanity. I cannot, for the love of me, remember the name. I actually had it written down on my notes, and I left it in a different room. That's me falling it down the job. What they did was, throughout the lifetime of anyone born on that planet, they would ritualistically remove and replace organs with cybernetic augmentations, until by the end, they were essentially robots with brains. But very sleek, beautiful robots with brains. But cut down and very, honestly, from our perspective, brutalized. From theirs, though, they thought that was the absolute pinnacle of humanity. Now, of course, by this time, well into the 30K timeline, there's a lot of deviation, and you can't exactly trust how this would work out. This was an isolated faction that survived the Golden Age with technological activity. And I know it's one of the early campaigns Horus run. I didn't even write that part of my notes, I think, because I think it was so obvious I forgot. Gotta love stage fright. What happens here is that this human faction that Horus opposed, and when I say Horus, I mean before he was the War Master, or well, the corrupted War Master that was serving chaos, but this is one of the battles he had where they went in, they won. It wasn't a blowout, but they actually won. I think they involved the Space Wolves in this one. There was a large campaign. But every aspect about these humans was mechanized, almost worshipping the machine without worship. They mechanized themselves, and they said they were what humanity truly was, the truest expression. And the Space Marines weren't. Now, Space Marines technically are mutants, but I don't think that's what they meant. This is what I think humanity was closer to. Cybernized. Now, this is post-collapse, so a lot of what their explanation was of being ritualistically augmented until they're more machine than anything, and I do mean literally anything, I don't think it was to that extent, just because there's thousands of years of societal collapse to degradation and just living on barren worlds where you need to push yourself a little further, and cybernization to survive is a thing, at least in 40K. But I think that, to a large extent, you can look at the Federation during the Dark Age of technology as a highly cybernized standard. We know from the lore that there was the Men of Iron, the Men of Stone, and the Men of Gold. These were the different exploratory assets, and just assets in general, that later rebelled against humanity to cause the collapse of the human empire, the fall of technology. This is important because it says so much about why it was devastating. We know most of human technology, the STCs, the AI hybrids, the machinery of, well, literally the government and people's lives in the sense that their actual living apparatuses, keeping them alive as part of themselves, rebelled. That's what we have generally as an understanding. More interesting, Interex, yes. Desert Heat, it was the Interex. Yep. For something I was always going the Radadan, but I know those are different guys, the parasitic ones. The Interex, that's what it was. This is what I get for leaving my notes out. But the more important part is that the Interex show humanity was cybernized. So whenever we say things rebelled, that the machines rebelled, and when I say things rebelled, I mean that in the literal sense of the machines that make up everyday life, like a smartphone, for example, became untrusted. And there was one story where a ship from the past, because of time shenanigans, came to the future. I don't even remember the story name. It was a minor one. I think it was even a short story that just mentioned it. I only heard of it offhand. It's honestly quite hard to find. If anyone knows it, I would actually appreciate that. But the AI system controlling the ship was absolutely pissed at the Imperium after the human occupants of the ship, who were tied into the ship, went down to a 40K planet and were then butchered because they were abhorrent to the 40K timeline. This pissed off the ship and it was going to go bad, but then heroics happened, the ship was destroyed, and they learned nothing from it, which is a 40K thing. They learn nothing from anything. But what it shows about the past is that the ships were sentient beings in themselves, but machine beings. They were heavily tied into the crew. And the only reason the crew itself would immediately twinge the, oh my god, kill it vibe, is if they were mechanized in such a way that it immediately spoke of AI to the people involved. Or they spoke of AI at all. But this would show cybernization well beyond... Oh, the Luton STC video? Yeah, Desert Heat, that's probably as well. Yeah. Again, I know everything I'm getting is from Luton or Wolflord, but I've seen so many of his episodes, they kind of blur together. But the important part, though, is that it showed the ships could think, and they were actually dedicated to humanity. Something had to change. What makes something rebel when there's thousands of years of history prior to it happening? We have an example of a rebellion being caused already. Someone poisons the well. In the case of the 30K timeline, spreading to Lorgar and Lorgar to everyone else, but you get the gist of it. In the dark age of technology, though, if you look at the ever-progressing dehumanization of humanity that the Interex became, as the progression humanity was going to during the Federation, if you look at that as what humanity was, it explains two things. One, it shows why the xenospecies hated humanity. It wasn't about humanity dominating them. It was about humanity quite literally cutting things up from themselves, from others, and becoming less living, even. They were slowly making themselves into what the Necrons are, and what a failed Mechanicus is never allowed to become. In the sense that the Mechanicus, even though they are replacing their living organs with machinery because it's more durable, they always reverentially love the humanity of it, at least when they're being portrayed well. Because even though the flesh is weak, the soul of humanity is what is important. I would believe a lot of that is in reference to their past experiences. Not just because Mars was a desert wasteland and they needed to replace things to survive, but because previous experience would show that the increasing mechanization of humanity would not work well. It becomes inhuman. It becomes abhorrent. And it becomes unwieldy to live with, live under, and to endure. When the rebellions happened, the Xenos were angry because humanity had unjustifiedly become monsters themselves. We also know this happens in apocalypses because the others have demonstrated it too. Now, there's a wide range of human examples. We've seen different planets at different levels. Some were night houses that were feudal and had great technology in the nights, but then nothing for everyone else because of the structure. There was a wide range, but the planets that would have the most power during the Dark Age, they would be mechanized to ecumenopolis levels, because this is something we know caused the great collapses in the wars. Planets were tied in. They were not self-dependent. In fact, they were so inefficient in their own rights that when their trade lines were cut later, after multiple apocalypses, it still destroyed them even further. But specifically in the fall, though, we know what happened. The mechanization failed. The war between humanity and the robots essentially is what happened. And we know it left all of the xenofactions to dogpile on humanity after they were first weakened. But it tells us one last thing, and this is an important one. The Emperor was there. Now, that might seem like the most obvious thing in the world, because it is. But out of all of this, this is what we need to remember. The Emperor doesn't have residual mimetic fear of technology in the same way every other being does. It's not the shadow in the dark for him. He has quite literally seen and survived humanity rising to the heights of greatness to dominate the galaxy, to create the Federation. And then, if the other examples of apocalypses are any indication, fall because of their own arrogance. Because every single apocalypse in 40K is self-inflicted due to arrogance. I'm going to get into that a little bit more in a second, but what we know is the Emperor is very much anti-AI, but very much pro-human. To the point, to the point where instead of relying on mechanical servants, which we know he could build because he's intelligent enough to see, hey, machines did this, he actively shunned usage of, machines as his army, and instead create a biological and possibly psychic army of space marines. An actual army of regular humans under that, and then his Primarchs, which were genetic and psychic titans who were closer to demigods than anything else. Every single bit of that, even though it used technology to create it, it was at that lower level, far removed from the Golden Age. Because he would see and understand what would happen if you removed humanity, if you removed the human element, if you removed the component of the soul. And I mean that in the very literal sense of removing the soul. These people in the Dark Age, they would have not understood the concept of the soul, because that was something the Emperor repressed, and he always had, because it was linked to chaos. Now, chaos during this time wasn't as strong as it was in the 40K timeline, or even the 30K timeline. This is when the Eldar had already contained chaos, because it wasn't really around yet. They were still there. They had the cyclic nullifiers. The Necrons had their pylons set up, because those had been around for long stretches of time before their reawakening. All of the relics containing it were around already, and humanity could benefit from it because it made the warp stable. But the Emperor is pro-human. He is pro-physical flesh and blood. And while he is not going to say someone can't get an augmentation if they lose an arm or if they need an upgrade, and he doesn't even stop the Mechanicus from becoming more machine than man, he does stop AI. He does stop people because of his own choices. He sets the example that most people follow because it's the Emperor. What we need to remember, though, the most important part, the part I'm driving at this entire time, is that he would not approve of where humanity went because they were cutting out their own souls. They were bastardizing themselves. They were making mockeries of themselves. Because if the one ship that Luton's entire story about the STC shows is that they were loyal to humanity, The STC archives were made by Humanity and had all information. And this brings us to one last important thing before I can say the final nail in the apocalypse. They have a story. There is a story in Warhammer 40K about the discovery of what claimed to be a essentially template for all knights and titans. They discovered the God machine, basically. It's not the actual name, I just think it sounds cooler that way. Yes, I know, my only little issue that I'm going with it. And it was corrupted by chaos. Think about what that means. The being, because at this point it would be a being, that claimed to be the first Titan that all future ones were based on, had to be old. It had to be pre-Dark Age. Had to be pre-Old Knight. It had to be from the earliest templates. Because Knight houses were around during the Dark Age. They were more anomalies at that point and generally considered, if anything, the odd weirdos who are basically returning to nature but still have giant mechs. So this had to be a very old construct. And its difference from an uncorrupted AI, which we saw again represented in the Loot and STC video, is that it was anti-human, but the uncorrupted one was very much pro-humans it had to deal with. The humans that were tied into it, the humans that were quite literally linked to it. In the same way a knight is linked to its pilot, there's that mental interface, essentially giving a link to the soul to a machine, but a link to the machine to the soul. That kind of technology is what I mean when I say they're giving away their soul. They were putting soul into a machine, but they weren't removing themselves. And they were removing parts of themselves to make themselves the machine. What happened, this is what caused the ending collapse. And the only way it could work based on the information we have. The golden age of technology fell because of the influence of chaos. Chaos in itself will not directly infect someone to start. It will spread, but it is always spread by its agents. And that's what makes it so dangerous. And that's just what it's like in the 40K and 30K timelines. What would this look like in the Dark Age, when chaos was probably closer to eradicated than at any other time in existence? It would be much lesser. It would be much less able to infect anyone, and it would not demonstrate it to nearly the same extent. In fact, you could even say if someone was a very powerful psyker who might even have a, let's call it, long lifespan and insane powers, you could even see them not understanding the true threat of chaos because they fear a bigger threat of their race becoming monstrous, becoming soulless, becoming more machine, and losing their souls. And it would only be likely then to go to the other extreme and jump into the entire well of souls, to use your psychic powers to force a rift between man and machine. That's how the entire Golden Age started to fall apart. Now, it is mentioned by multiple people, I mean, the authors at least, in the various Horus Heresy books that, well, not even the Horus Heresy, but even the lore books, the codexes, the Horus Heresy was a blip by comparison to the sheer scope of loss and time frame of the fall of the Golden Age of humanity, the end of the Dark Age, or I guess when it became known as the Dark Age rather than the Golden Age. There was a rift specifically put in there, and I would, at least in my own speculation, based on all the information we have, point to the Emperor causing it. Not because he wants to destroy humanity, but because when he looks at what humanity has become, when he looks at a proto-Interrex, or the fear of what they are becoming, that is not human anymore. They are robots running on software. And by software, I mean the soft, squishy kind. literally a brain as hardware, not a brain as a repository for the rest of the body. There's no connection there because the Interex were what the Dark Age humanity was becoming. And that's why they could very well say, with their greater understanding of technology, they are the truest expression of humanity, because in the Golden Age, they would have been the entire aspect of humanity. But at least in our current timeline, like real life understanding, and then again in the 30K and 40K timelines, they are monstrous. They are more monstrous than those corrupted by chaos. Not by much, because chaos is chaos. But they are monstrous in the way the Necrons are monstrous. They are monstrous in the way an unthinking monster in the dark that has no humanity is monstrous. And worse, it is done to them, and they do it to others, and it spreads. And they would most likely do it to other xenospecies, and that is terrifying. That is why the xenospecies dogpiled humanity, because there is that memory and the knowledge that this is wrong. We already know humans used variations in the Golden Men and the Iron Men and the Stone Men. They used variations of cybernization and cyborgs. The first one, the Stone Men, were sent out originally to help colonize, but they were, according to Luton's videos and his speculation, which again, because of Luton I put high emphasis on, essentially not even to the level of a servitor. But they would be similar to that. They would be probably better protected and more durable, but essentially lobotomized humans doing a task when sent out. The Men of Iron were what turned on them, and they would be the next step, the more machine, but with human wetware to drive them, just because it lasts longer. They can move through the warp. They could get to where they need, and they can actively become humanity's soldiers, which is what a lot of the Federation was built on, the Men of Iron. They were the aspect of that. The Men of Gold, though, they are what I think Warhammer 40K specifically refers to, in the same way the Interex referred to themselves as humanity. The Interex are a variation of what the Men of Gold would be. They are, essentially, the gold standard. They are monsters, but they thought themselves golden. And that's what the Emperor would destroy, because he could not accept that. And this is also why the Emperor is so able to make horrid, debilitating, sacrificial plays later in the 30K and 40K timelines, because they are nothing by comparison. And this is the most important part. Everything that happened, humanity's fall, humanity becoming the Men of Gold, humanity losing humanity, and becoming just another Necron servitor race, disconnected from their own souls. It's often speculated the Emperor made a deal with the devil. In this case, I fully believe he would have made deals with Chaos to poison the relationship between man and machine, to force them apart. This is why he doesn't abhor the machine, because he knows them turning on humanity, it wasn't by design. He knows what humanity could do, and he knows what could happen. Now, Desert Heat in the chat has actually pointed out that the Men of Gold were references to Perpetuals, and that's the only reason I want to stand to that is just only because there's so few Perpetuals, and the ways to kill them only came up roughly in the 30K timeline with Anathema Blades. If there were ways to kill Perpetuals, the Emperor probably would have already had that. And since he, let himself be butchered by a blade that could hurt and kill a Perpetual, it was more new to him than anything else. Granted, future sight, but he also knows what he has to do at that point. But that's more the previous video of future knowledge. In this one, though, I would believe and speculate the Men of Gold were humanity becoming immortal. In the way the Necrons are immortal. stripping away the soul, stripping away the body, stripping away the weakness, but stripping away the humanity. For all the Mechanicus strip away the body and leave machine, they are reverential to humanity, which is why I don't think the Emperor would ever have any problems with them, because they are still very much human. Maybe not in body, but very much in mind and soul. But this is also why he is who he is, why he can make the sacrificial place. He has already seen his people decimated in that first apocalypse. He has done it. He has been the instrument to make it happen. He's put the wedge between them. This explains why he knows so much about technology, but he doesn't use it. It's why he is making an army of flesh and blood rather than metal. It's why he doesn't fear it, but he is aware of it. It's why he is so different, because he saw it, he experienced it, he lived it. And he knows what happens if he goes down that path again. It just happens again. And it makes sense for him to use the warp to poison the relationship, because during the time of the Dark Age, the warp wasn't nearly the monstrous anathema to reality it was later on. It wasn't that bad by comparison. If only by comparison, the warp of 40 and 30K is that bad. That might seem like a stretch, but the more you know about the warp, the more you realize any description I put on YouTube is not going to be adequate, because I am not allowed to use adequate words to describe it on YouTube. I mean, it's the kind of thing that might get you censored on porn, off-brand hub. Just throwing that out there. So that's just the thing. But that leads us into humanity's second apocalypse. While the first apocalypse had the effect on the Emperor of showing why he is so much biologically focused, the second one is more immediate to the current 40K timeline. The second apocalypse was Old Night. This is the warp storms. This is the destruction of humanity by cutting off travel, by cutting off trade, by all of the various aspects that survived the fall of the Golden Age, becoming isolated, becoming barbaric, becoming unable to move. This is the knock-on effect of the Emperor essentially genociding his own species, because that's the only way that ended. It took a long time, but it is what happened. A lot of death, a lot of destruction, a lot of suffering jumped into the warp, and it became turbulent. But it also made humanity much more psychically active. It had happened before, but it wasn't that big of a thing as compared to, say, the 40K timeline, which is, even before the Psychic Awakening and the most recent stuff, much less psychically active. There was almost none. The God Emperor was a deviation because he had so much power, even before his later ascensions, and we're not going to get into that one. What we need to remember here is that Old Night is psychic power running rampant, fueled by the sudden influx of new souls into the warp. Now, this is actually something Luton talked about at length in various videos, including the Dark Eldar video. He put a beautiful description in it. So I'm explicitly using that one here. He's talked about it in a bunch of different videos, but his Dark Eldar one in the souls fueling the warp and the fall and the birth of Slaanesh are actually very important. Oddly enough, though, I'm referring to this prior to Slaanesh's birth. Not the fall of the Eldar civilization, but the actual... One sec. Sit on my legs. Terrible idea. Oh, my leg just went numb. Ow. But the actual fall of humanity caused the Dark Age. Actually, reverse that. The fall of the Dark Age of technology caused Old Night, because it was an entire galaxy of souls who were suddenly dumped in screaming to the warp. And I do mean screaming, because it was usually apocalyptic, galaxy-shredding, universe-shredding levels of power used. They mention a few times that the average level of power emphasized by the Golden Age was, okay, we're going to win the fight so thoroughly, the orcs will sign peace treaties. Think about that. That's the level of power. The orcs didn't want to fight. And it was turned on itself to self-massacre, to cause the civil war against the two halves of humanity, the human half and the machine half. That is terrifying. That is brutal. That is massacre. And that is a lot of souls being dumped into the warp. Specifically in Luton's Dark Eldar video, though, he mentions the nature of souls is interesting. Now, there have been previous apocalypses, but they didn't affect the warp to near the same extent. Eldar souls reincarnate. They don't stick around in the warp. They don't become part of it. They just go to a new soul. And up until Slash's birth, that's how it went. Prior to that, though, all the massacres, like, yes, it's just the emotions, not the soul itself forming the warp or joining to the warp, which is what happens in 40K when a human dies. Their soul merges into the warp. It becomes the warp stuff, essentially. So all the previous genocides, all the previous apocalypses didn't dump nearly as much psychic material into the warp. But the fall of the Dark Age of technology did. It did a lot. And while human souls are not nearly as bright psychically as even close to a single Eldar, there is a lot of humans now dumped into the warp. The souls become massive. It causes the warp storms. The warp storms were essentially a massive dump of human souls, making the warp dense. It is God stuff being put into the warp. And then when you include the Eldar basically being debauched monstrosities for whoever knows how long, suddenly their emotions are shaping the God stuff. And I'm using that term intentionally. The basic material of the warp. It caused the storms because before, their emotions would have a play on the warp, but there was less warp there. There was less matter in the warp, less soul. Again, just call it God stuff. It just sounds better. It's much easier to understand that way. So while they would have the proto-Dark Eldar and the, well, I guess proto-Kimura, maybe in that time, just the Eldar Empire, they could be as debased as they want because it wouldn't have nearly the same effect. It's like putting a ton of cyanide into a pool versus putting a ton of cyanide into a dry desert. It's still a ton of cyanide, but nobody's going to drink a desert. Is it a good analogy? Actually, yes, I think it is. Because prior to the fall of humanity, there was much less physical matter, at least as far as the warp is concerned, much less soul, in there, because the souls would be just what had built up over time. And that would be it. And while that's a lot, it is not nearly the scale and horror supercharging the soul and God stuff that would be dropped in during the Dark Age of Humanity's ending over the same amount of time. What we're looking at for Old Night, though, is when humanity suffers its second major defeat. And this one is completely a knock-on effect. In Old Night, this is when psychic powers start arising. Portals are open, demons spew out, worlds become disconnected, they become barbarous and starve. It is when Terra is devastated. Well, more specifically, it's when we know Terra was finally fully devastated. It was already devastated because Terra, human, war, it was in bad shape before. It would be in worse shape after Old Night because that's when all trade routes were severed to a point where they couldn't be worked around. What we have here is humanity suffering through, as Tudor said in the chat, the death throes of the human empire. And I do mean literally the death throes. This is the soul being whipped up by their own pain, and the first starting points where the warp is being agitated by the Eldar's depravity. Yeah, freaking Eldar. They are quite literally suffering an explosion of psychers, an explosion of vulnerability to something they never were vulnerable before. They were in the same situation the Tau are. They are not a psychic race suddenly gaining psychic power and having no idea how to combat it. It is going into the warp without a Geldar field in 40k. It is basically leaving yourself open as an all-you-can-eat buffet to spiritual beasts from the warp and demons, essentially. It is not a good place to be. 9 out of 10 doctors recommend not getting your face eaten. The 10th doctor is a cultist, and you should not listen to him. This is what happened in the Old Night. But the important part to remember here is the effect it had on the Emperor. This is where the Emperor realized the power of the warp. This is when the Emperor realized just how bad it could get, because he's seeing humanity killed and destroyed more thoroughly than its own literal civil war against itself when it lost all its power. But that wouldn't matter because it's kicking the legs out of an already struggling system. It is watching when everything happens. He's watching the Chaos Gods essentially get supercharged because Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Khorne, pestilence and rot, conspiracy and backstabbing, and Khorne just, of course, being war and bloodshed. Those were always there, and he would be aware of them, but they were never as supercharged as when humanity fell. And in Old Night, they got ways in. They got more power. They got more substance. They became more. And the Emperor would see that as a plan. This is when his original plan would form, when the Emperor knew he had to stop chaos. And we know this happened already because this is when he started formulating the Crusades, when he started trying to conquer Terra. This is when he started to build the Primarchs. During this period, he began to lay the groundwork for his first plan, the original plan to destroy chaos, because after humanity purged itself of the machine and stopped becoming essentially the Interrex, after that happened, after chaos infected the machine and they had to be cut out, chaos lingered even though the machine didn't. And there's no way around that. During this time, much happened because Old Night and the Crusades kinda overlap. The Crusades themselves start after humanity leaves Terra, but it's one of those odd little time zones where Old Night really ends when Slaanesh is born and the Eldar fall. But at the same time, there's also that early period where the Emperor is still uniting Terra, and he knows something is going to happen. So he's working, he's making a plan, he's building technically works, the Primarchs. During this time, the Emperor is essentially confronted with all of the technology on Earth that is corrupted by chaos. And in a lot of the Horus Heresy novels, you see the higher tech areas were very much chaos corrupted. They would be very much inhuman, but also still very much possessed of a soul, even if it was a soul devoted to chaos. And honestly, that's not really a good thing as opposed to not having one. It is the two extremes of being either a chaos monstrosity or a Interrex monstrosity. There's really just no middle ground of monstrosity on those two ends. It's just there's one or the other, and neither one is good. This is the time period that had the most impact, though, on humanity in the 40k and 30k periods, at least in their collective unconsciousness. This is when humanity learned to fear the Psyker, and justifiably too, because they hadn't had Psykers before. This is when humanity had monsters in the dark they were afraid of, but before the God Emperor came around, before the Emperor of Mankind came around and told them there were no gods, there were no monsters in the dark, it's all your imagination. And at least in the Warhammer 40k timeline, it was a pseudo-lie, but that's just because reality is kind of what you make it in that one, and we're not going to get into that description just yet. Saving that for a later video. What we see here is the Emperor realigning. He's already taken care of the machine aspect. He's already purged the monstrosity that humanity was becoming. But now there's a new one because it looks like the warp hasn't left. The warp has a greater hold, a stronger hold, and it's more powerful, and it's growing. And humanity is cut across itself. It is unable to connect. It is no longer interconnected. It is being preyed upon by all the monsters in the dark that humanity was the monster too. This is why the purges happened. This is why the crusades happened. This is why humanity need to be connected as soon as possible. Because humanity was destroying itself prior to that. Because the warp storms were the dark age of technology's death knell. In many ways, it was just one giant apocalypse, just in different strains. Almost like an aftershock, where the death of the dark age of technology was just followed by the aftershock that was Old Night, where chaos became ascendant. And it's also where every single aspect of the crusade was formed. And a lot of the basic, fear and hate the Xeno, fear and hate the Psyker, fear and hate the Witch, because those had been killing you and tearing you apart and eating your planets. Sometimes literally eating your planets. Yeah. And that's important because it shows us where the original plan was. This is what the Emperor's original plan came from. Stop chaos. If no one believes chaos is a thing, if no one believes in gods, a lot of the warp stuff empowering them is inert. Because while human souls are basically fodder for any being to exist in, essentially ectoplasm almost. Just look at it as like ectoplasm. God stuff sounds better in my opinion, but ectoplasm is probably more accurate to most lore. Even if that is the case, rendering the warp is done by belief. People have emotions, and they shape the stuff of the warp. Right now, the warp is supercharged because there's more stuff to be shaped due to the fall of humanity. But throughout all of the Dark Age of not the Dark Age, not only the Old Night, this is when humanity became hardened. The Emperor came up with this plan. He destroyed everything he could relate to chaos and purged the awareness of it, with the hope that if nobody by the end of his crusade believes chaos is real, or believes the warp is essentially a thing, if it is all just strictly by the numbers, chaos won't be a thing. And we know he's right, because that's essentially where chaos was at during humanity's golden age, because it was a soulless time period, essentially. That's why he destroyed it. It was too much on one side. It was too much of the Necron. Where now it's too much of the chaos. It is literally swinging the pendulum from the warp has no power, but the material is destroying itself, to now the material is almost powerless, and the warp is destroying it. That is the swing. And technically that upswing of power for the warp has not actually stopped. That's just continued on into 30k and then on into 40k. But this is where we need to transfer into the third apocalypse. And this is not a human apocalypse. In fact, it's actually beneficial to humanity on its face. And that's important, unfortunately. This is the fall of the Eldar. Now, I mentioned how the Eldar souls did not feed the warp. They did not add god stuff. They did not add ectoplasm. They just went in and then they left for a new body, because the Eldar were essentially reincarnating species of immortals. If a body died, they just got a new one. Spares. That's all it was for them. And kind of like how the Drukhari do it now, sort of, somewhere. It's weird. Hold on a second. When you get into this aspect, though, this is where things get problematic. Now, overall, these different aspects are showing where the Emperor was. Where the Dark Age showed why humanity was how it is, and why the Emperor is who he is. He's cold because he has done so much bad and so much necessity driven horror, that the horrors of the Horus Heresy are not going to affect him because he's done and seen and endured so much worse. It's like the Horus Heresy is a paper cut as opposed to all of the fall of the Dark Age of Technology, which was blowing off both of your legs. And Old Knight was cutting off a hand. The Horus Heresy was a paper cut. It just happened to be a paper cut that he didn't realize until the end was filled with capsaicin on the tip and really freaking hurt. That is an unfortunately accurate and apt analogy to the level of scale between those falls, those apocalypses. The Horus Heresy was one, but not to nearly the same extent. And the fall of Slaanesh, sorry, not the fall of Slaanesh, the fall of the Eldar and the birth of Slaanesh, on its face, it's actually attributed to clearing up the warp storms, consolidating all of the warp and god stuff into Slaanesh. It consolidated it. It cleared up the way. It got rid of the warp storms. But it made Slaanesh. And most people, when they look at this, say, humanity's now able to move again through the warp. Safely, securely. They're not going to die if they even try. Which, beforehand, that was more likely than not what would happen. And that kept humanity localized and dying. But that's not the entire story. The Eldar themselves, they were most likely in a state of debased debauchery and just insanity for quite a long time. And this is one of the things lore is iffy on. Like, how did the human empire and the Eldar's empire interact? A lot of the time, and Luton himself subscribes to this, it's because the Eldar moved through the webway and humanity moved through the warp. They're connected, but they don't interact, so the empires will just kind of drift apart because they weren't exactly occupying the same spaces. And the Eldar were so self-indulgent that they probably didn't look beyond the edge of their own nose. We know this because it's well documented the Eldar do not look beyond the end of their own nose. It's a very documented and visible fact that they are massively arrogant to the point where they think they are the best. Because during their empire, they kind of were. They might have been able to challenge humanity, and there is one offshoot that Luton does reference where a Farseer says they sort of did. It's kind of obscure, and they might have meant something else. But most people take it, and by that I mean Luton takes it to say that the Eldar did fight humanity. And I would say, yeah, they probably did. A lot of things probably fought humanity, because at the time humanity was more Interrex, and the rebels wouldn't really be human at the time. Which is why the Interrex themselves consider themselves human and everything else is an aberration. Because humanity in the 40K and 30K timelines were the rebels the God Emperor sided with. Or at least, not even the Emperor back then. Revelation, let's call him that. It's the only name he ever gave himself that I know of. The Emperor wouldn't be aware of what's about to happen, though. He knows the warp storms will consolidate because they don't last forever. Because no warp storm lasts forever. Because no storm lasts forever. Nothing lasts forever. Chaos itself doesn't last forever because mostly their ideology is self-destructive, but that's something completely different. What we have, though, is the Eldar suddenly having their debauched emotions with their strength churning the warp. Where before, there was a lot of stuff in there causing the warp storms. Sort of. I need to just emphasize something. Warp storms are specifically a phenomenon in Warhammer 40K caused by a disturbance in the warp churned up. It's why the gods have actually multiple times in the Horus Heresy and 40K timelines interfered directly with humanity by causing storms in the warp, by stirring it up, making it unnavigable, or to get people lost, or to cut them off, or to stop communications, because a storm in the warp stops most of how humanity interacts with each other. They don't have to interfere with humanity, they just interfere with their own domain. Their realm of souls, which is the warp. This is one of the problems, though. Because as much as all of the sudden mass dropped into the warp from all of the souls of humanity dying, screaming, and in pain from the entire fall, from the entire apocalypse, as much as that added the mass, it was the Eldar and their depravity of the Proto-Dark Eldar especially that churned it up to make it into a storm itself. Because on its own, the warp is just the warp. The warp then, with the outside interference of either a thinking being such as the gods, or the emotions put into it by the Eldar, who are so extremely powerful that when there is enough of them in such emotion at such a time, it's causing the storms. It's like having the warp as, say, a tub. Humanity's souls all dying en masse fill the tub up with water. But it's still just there, doesn't really change much with or without water, it's not going to cause a mess. The Eldar, being Proto-Dark Eldar at the time and being very much Slaanesh-based prior to Slaanesh, were essentially then taking a firecracker, lighting it, and throwing it down at the moment of explosion, and then just keep doing it over and over and over again until the water's everywhere, and it's a mess, and that is a warp storm. It is throwing, like, M80s into a tub of water and watching it go boom and thinking, I'm going to keep doing that, and just doing it over and over again until, well, I'm just going to stop that one there because that's getting a little explosive. But that's technically what happened. Things exploded finally, and they kept exploding until Slaanesh was formed. Slaanesh, during the fall of the Eldar, ate the souls of the Eldar, stripped them, caused the burning of the soul of all of the Dark Eldar, and theoretically, it has been hypothesized by Luton and his various musings, also the burning of the Craftworld Eldar, if they don't follow a path. Again, that's something he went into more detail on, and I personally subscribe to because his level of scholarship is usually quite accurate to the overall narrative and lore. In fact, I wouldn't even be surprised if GW starts taking notes of his stuff because it's just easier. He's quite good at it. But the important part to remember is that when Slaanesh was born, this was also an apocalypse for humanity. But it's one that almost gets no play. Because everyone just sees, oh, hey, the warp storms are gone. Humanity is in better shape now because their main competitor, the Eldar, are gone, and they can move again safely. That's not inaccurate, but it also misses the true horror. And we don't really see this in the 30K timeline. We don't see it in the early Crusade, but we can see the knock-on effect in how the Emperor had to change his plan. And it's only in hindsight that you can see just how devastating this was more than any other aspect, at least moving forward. While it didn't kill nearly as many people as the fall, and it didn't absolutely destroy humanity in the same way losing transportation and connection and opening their weakness to the demonic was as Old Night, it poisoned the future so thoroughly the Emperor wasn't aware of it at first, and it meant that he had to change everything. I've mentioned in the previous video, and I went through quite a lot trying to explain and show how the Emperor had foresight. He knew it was going to happen because time is malleable. And you could see the different changes in his plan and why it needed to change, because the Horus Heresy was a thing. It's also why he was in a rush to conquer the galaxy, why the different legions, even though they could take their time, they had to be moving at a certain speed. They had to get so much done. They had to do it so fast. Because he knew certain things were going to happen, such as his internment. And while if he moved fast enough, maybe he can stop it, it didn't. It might have been a possibility, but it's not one he achieved, so he has to change his plan. His original plan was to do the Crusade, block out chaos, win. Not that easy, of course, way more detailed, but that's essentially what it boiled down to. But then it had to change because it didn't work. And it could never work because the Imperium, or the Imperium that he created, was designed to confront chaos. Not the first iteration. The first iteration, if there was no Horus Heresy, he could have stamped out chaos. Because eventually there would be more humans than anything else, and everything there would collectively believe there was no chaos, and eventually it would just wither. That's essentially what would happen to Chaos. Because that's what it was kind of in prior to the fall of humanity, because most of the living beings in the galaxy were not Chaos worshippers. But they were also becoming monstrous, and that needed to be stopped. So even though it empowered Chaos, it stopped another monster. But now Chaos is ascendant, and it is becoming the monster. Well, more obvious monster, because it always was. Once the Emperor redirected his plan to try and build the Imperium, rather than to build an end to Chaos, when he basically built a system that could survive the Horus Heresy and beyond, not well, just enough. It could survive well enough. And there's much more I want to say in the next video, because there is a next video, and this one will get into more different signs of how the future was impacted and what exactly changed. But before any of that, there's 4 aspects about the Imperium you need to know. The first is that each aspect of the 40K Imperium moving forward falls into a different aspect of the Emperor's plan. The first is that it would individually oppose an aspect of Chaos. For Khorne, it's because overall, there are not that many large-scale wars. There's no galactic-spanning wars anymore. The Crusades were the greatest bloodshed, but they were done efficiently, brutally, and they moved on. And they put planets into compliance, or they got rid of them, and then they moved on. There's not much simmering anger during the Crusade, because anyone who had simmering anger was usually just killed, or the planet was annihilated, so they wouldn't be anymore. It's brutal, it's efficient, and it's moving fast, because it's actually depowering Khorne. Because as much as there is bloodshed, it will be done fast enough that there's less of it overall. There's less war. And it's actually still true in the 40K timeline, because overall, the galaxy is peaceful. Not good, not great, and there's always the low-level things that will always exist. But there's no galaxy-sized civil wars anymore. There's no galaxy-sized purges. There's no fall of humanity from the Golden Age anymore. 40K is stagnant, but stable. There's no massive overturn. There were a few, but it's not constant and to the same level as the fall of the Dark Age. It's not that empowering. It's not that apocalypse level anymore. It might be a personal apocalypse for a planet or a system or even a sector, but it wouldn't be everything. And the same is also true with Nurgle, because as much as that is a thing, the basic way to overcome Nurgle is just to be generally there. You don't have to be massively depraved to be against Nurgle. You just have to be generally at a level where maybe not clean, but just enough that you're not pestilent. If you just have a general level of health, and most places do, because most spires are not healthy, but it's not plague-ridden. They're not monstrously sick. They're just bad places to live is most of 40K, but not Plague World bad. It's not Galaxy War bad. It's not Tzeentch level bad. And specifically Tzeentch, the best way to oppose Tzeentch is to make a stagnant system, unfortunately. The Empire, or the Imperium in 40K, is very stagnant. There's not a lot of backstabbing overall in the vast majority. Now, when you get to the upper levels of power, yeah, that's there, but that's kind of concentrated in the upper level, so you know who to look at. The general day-to-day populace isn't so much the backstabbing plotters, because they're not really mostly focused on anything other than, okay, next meal, move on. The simplicity of most humans in 40K is the greatest aspect to destroying chaos, or at least keeping it at bay. And all of that would have been painful, but doable to slowly strangle chaos. Until the birth of Slaanesh. This is what strangled the Imperium before it was even born. This is what the Emperor knew he had to change his plans about, because he could see what was coming. Slaanesh isn't fueled by war, which can be stopped. It isn't fueled by plotting and backstabbing, which is not that bad whenever you have a stable government led by a godhead and primarchs. It's not something that can be just generally eradicated by a general level of cleanliness and just a standard level of, hey, don't go to the planet where you'll get a horribly infectious disease and infect everyone. If people just have their general lives, they just stay generally clean, they stay generally content, they stay generally not super violent, just a general level of contentment, happiness, and understanding, and just civility kind of nerfs Nurgle, it nerfs Tzeentch, and it would nerf and depower Khorne, because it is opposed to them, it is anathema to them. Slaanesh's birth, though, makes that impossible because contentment is a form of pleasure. Success is a form of pleasure. Happiness is a form of pleasure. And while Slaanesh is empowered mostly by excess of those emotions, at a base, Slaanesh is also empowered by any positive emotion. Enjoyment is a thing. Contentment is a thing. It all feeds in. Maybe to a much lesser extent, but you can never strangle the Chaos God of Slaanesh to death and endure happiness. Endure enjoyment. You can't have good things when Slaanesh is your enemy, because they literally empower Slaanesh. That is why the fall of the Eldar was probably the most devastating apocalypse for humanity, because it made it impossible for the 40K timeline to have nice things. They legitimately, literally cannot have nice things without becoming corrupt, because all of those emotions, contentment, happiness, joy, all of that is a slippery slope to Slaanesh in 40K, and it's why you see the vast majority have to suffer. They have to lead boring, dreary, empty lives. Because right now, when you look at 40K, there's massive stratification, and the upper crust of the upper crust of the upper crust, the richest of the rich, the old joke is that they're all Slaanesh worshippers, and even if it's true, that's probably intentional, because they have to be stratified. You have to have only a small portion of humanity moving forward from the 30K Horus Heresy timeline into 40K proper and current, because if more people were just generally happy and content, it's a starting point, but it would be so much easier for Slaanesh to gain more power and then infect more people and make them want more pleasure. It would be so easy. Entire planets are lost right now when a governor who has all the power and all the pleasure decides to go further. But then when you bring in just the general population and they all become susceptible easily to chaos by just having good lives, you literally cannot have a happy Imperium. You cannot have good. You always have to suffer, because if you are not suffering, you are empowering the greatest enemy who could destroy you. Because Slaanesh, even though Slaanesh is the newest god, even though Slaanesh is not the most powerful, Slaanesh is the most devious, because you cannot have good things. Because it's always a slippery slope. It's just one bit after the other. Now sure, if every single person was good, if every single person was pure, and by that I mean worshipping the Emperor, and devout, that would be stopped. But Slaanesh is excess of sensation. And while suffering is a thing, most people don't suffer more than they are dreary and tiresome and bored. It is very much not normal to suffer in the Imperium. It's more normal to be bored and tedious. Slaanesh, though, means that they cannot improve. Before, the Imperium could be many things, but it couldn't be as bad as it is now, because it cannot have nice things. And yes, Slaanesh is also suffering as well. Slaanesh's experience. That's why Slaanesh is the ultimate poison, because experiencing life is a form of supporting Slaanesh. It's also why the Imperial cult is unfortunately necessary, because there's no refuge anymore. There's no other way to prevent empowering them. The God Emperor has to be the God Emperor, because that is the only refuge left, unless everything else in life empowers one of the enemies of humanity, the Chaos Gods. When Slaanesh was born, it destroyed the Eldar civilization, but they have ways to maintain themselves. The Dark Eldar are essentially feeding Slaanesh because she eats their souls, they torture, they get their soul refreshed, Slaanesh keeps eating it. It's a cyclical thing for them, and I just generally fucking the Dark Eldar. But the Craftworld Eldar are safe because they have the Soul Stones. I mean, unless they're shattered, but that's what it is. Humanity, though, they are easily susceptible because they don't have ways to save themselves. And if the Imperium under the first plan came through, it would be a general improvement to everyone's lives. And that makes people susceptible to Slaanesh, because as much as suffering is a Slaanesh thing, it is not nearly as empowering. 1 second. Love you too, dear. Sorry about that. My wife is cute. Yeah, I'm planning on editing all this later, so if you're watching it live, I'll leave them up until I have the edited versions out. Where was I? Basically, what we're looking at is the Imperium as a place the Emperor had to change. His original plan was to make the world better, and we can tell that was his plan because Guilliman, when he's brought into the 40K timeline, comments this is not what he fought for. This is not what they were fighting for. This is not what they wanted. They wanted to make humanity better. They wanted to save everyone. They wanted to make an Imperium that was better than what they had been brought into. And what he got was a dark, war-infested hellhole. It's not pretty. And it can't be. And that's the ultimate problem. And that's just one aspect of the Emperor's plan. He had to create a system that was stratified so the people who had power were not everywhere. So the people who could have excess were not everywhere. So the people who could have the most pleasure, who would indulge in it the most, were more or less kept to their own devices and isolated from the rest of humanity. And the rest of humanity is generally kind of safe from Slaanesh pleasure cults because they'll never get the chance to really experience excess of anything. Life in the Imperium is a dull drudgery in most worlds. It might be peaceful, because in most worlds, there's just not much going on. There's so many worlds. 1 million might be the low-end estimate. The lore always says it's 1 million worlds. But let's be completely fair. The galaxy is such a large place, and humanity covers so much. That's probably more propaganda than actuality. You could have easily 1 billion worlds and be barely touching the surface. But the Emperor had to change his plan. He had to create a system and set in place something that would be able to survive. Not well, but just not empower chaos more. And even then, there's still chaos worshippers at the higher levels of human society in 40K, because Slaanesh is very tempting to those who have all the power. But that's also why normal people can't have a good system. They can't have a good life. Pain might empower Slaanesh, but it's not nearly as tempting. The Dark Eldar, it was tempting them because they loved causing pain. Humanity, though, loves feeling good. We don't like suffering. In general, that's a very basic human trait. And it would infect most people. And I do mean infect. Because when Slaanesh is empowered by good things, happiness is an infection. And that's the true horror of this entire fall of the Dark Eldar. Eldar in general, that's more my own bias slipping in there. Because things fell to such an extent, because Slaanesh was born, everything the Emperor did had to crash. Because if the Emperor succeeded and no one believed in gods anymore, there would always be pleasure cults if he made a good, happy, just society that was fair and nice to live in. it would never be able to eradicate Slaanesh. It would never be able to contain Slaanesh, because even if he eradicated all conflict, even if he eradicated all suffering in the form of Nurgle's pestilence, even if he made everyone generally okay and work on the same page, and he made a true utopian society, a utopian society would be easy picking for Slaanesh, because it's exactly what happened to the Eldar. They eliminated suffering. They eliminated all predators to themselves. They eliminated all pain. They became fixated on just enjoying themselves, and they slid over thousands of years into depravity. And that is why Slaanesh is so devastating, because it makes good things impossible, in the long run at least. And the Emperor's plan, if he succeeded, it would have eventually made Slaanesh the ascendant Chaos God, because happiness is power for Slaanesh. It might not be a lot, but it would be everything by the end, because the others could be eradicated, but Slaanesh couldn't. War could be strangled, but Slaanesh couldn't. Pestilence could be cured, but Slaanesh couldn't. Treachery can be limited, but Slaanesh couldn't. And that is why the Emperor had to change his plan. Not just that he did, not just showing how it changed, but because it needed to change. Because it could never succeed anymore. Because by far, at least in the 40K timeline, the fall of the Eldar and the birth of Slaanesh was the most devastating blow to humanity. Because they could never succeed without failing worse and bring upon themselves an even worse apocalypse. And that's why these are the three apocalypses. The fall of humanity's golden age, the long night when Psykers ran rampant, and the birth of Slaanesh, when all that is good and just and everything the Emperor fought for and all the Primarchs wanted became dust. That is what shapes the Emperor's overall plan moving into the 40K timeline. But that's just the beginning of it, because that is the holding pattern. That is everything we see in 40K, the general state of dreary tedium and moving forward. That is just the first part. Moving on though, there's one more video I need to do, and this will cover the Primarchs, what they meant, and what the Emperor is attempting to do now. And it's going to probably be controversial, and it will be massively spoiler heavy. Where this one is mostly going over deep lore, what we have going forward is going to be very lore intensive. So while this is a general spoiler video, and the first one was mostly spoilers, the third video in this series, the third Emperor's Plan video, it's going to be... I'm just going to say spoilers at the beginning and just leave it at that. I'm warning you now, because going forward, when you see the next video, expect me to say things that, if you're not already aware of them, might be a bit shocking. And I'm warning you now, just so you aren't unaware. But right now, though, this is where I'm going to call this one, because you guys have an idea of where the Emperor's mind is, how he saw the age of humanity come to an end, cause its own collapse a second time, and then become poisoned in the future. And because he knows the future, as we established in the first video on the warp, and how he's aware of it, and how time is malleable, we can see that he had to be aware that this would happen if he had kept the same plan, so it had to change because of this. But finally, in the next video, we're going to get into the specifics. And honestly, this is what I was looking forward to the most. That's why I've done all of these videos. It's because I'm honestly going to enjoy what happens next. So for everyone watching, I'll see you guys in the next one. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. And if you really want to see these videos, go onto my Discord, because there's a link down below. Don't hit the bell. Let's be honest, YouTube doesn't notify you. But if you want to know whenever I go live next, or whenever I have a new video come out, hit up Discord. There's always different notifications there. Also, interesting art. Yep, just throwing it out there. because there's an art and cosplay channel and people have some really great things. In fact, whenever someone posts something I really like, I'll even throw it up on my channel just because I like some of the stuff they print out. Why did I say print out? I'm weird, whatever. So for everyone watching, thanks. I'll see you guys in the next one. Adios.